in the middle of the fair, but joining us now is Ronald Goldfarb. He is the editor of this book, After Snowden, Privacy, Secrecy, and Security in the Information Age. Now, Mr. Goldfarb, you're the editor of this book, but in your own opinion, what's been the impact of Edward Snowden?
Well, the impact has been extraordinary. In the couple of years since his revelations were made public, the world has changed in ways that would never have happened if he didn't. So whatever you think about him, whether you believe he's an angel or a devil, and people have strong feelings about that, you can't deny the fact that courts have now ruled that the procedures that he questioned were illegal and unconstitutional. The White House has had 36, I think, different changes that they issued as a result of his disclosures. The European Union just passed a resolution honoring him and saying that he should not be extradited in any of the member countries. The major social networks, you know, the Microsofts and the Yahoos and Googles, etc., have changed their practices because it turned out they lost about $40 billion when the disclosures became public, and it was seen that people who used those social media weren't guaranteed the privacy they thought they had. So there's no question that the world has changed in very dramatic ways, I would argue for the better.
But you recently had John Brennan, the CIA director, coming out and saying we're being hamstrung, that we can't get this information that we need to prevent terrorism.
Right. Well, I mean, the CIA and NSA have been called to account for some of these procedures. Their position is when national security is endangered, they ought to be given, if not a carte blanche, very wide discretion to do what they need to do. Nobody would argue that national security isn't crucial and important, and especially in dangerous times of terroristic acts like we've seen just this week, that we have to be very dutiful in terms of what we do and have done in our name. Anybody who would argue otherwise is foolish. There's a famous quote of Justice Robert Jackson that the Constitution isn't a suicide pact. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that anything goes. After World War II, which was considered the Great War, where we fought against fascism, and tens of thousands of American lives were lost. In the history of those times, we've come back to question some of the things we did, even in that quote-unquote Great War, such as the internment of Japanese American citizens. And now, in the wake of 9/11, we're questioning similarly things like extreme rendition, which is really the kidnapping and torturing of suspects in crimes. So our book takes the position that national security and constitutional liberty are not an either-or proposition, but we have to strike an exquisite balance between assuring both of them. And at different times and different periods, the pendulum will swing as to how much we want to give one interest in competition with another, and that will always be changing from time to time. But it's important, even at times of great pressure like this, to say that we want national security protectors to do everything in our name to ensure domestic tranquility, but that doesn't mean anything. Torture, for example, I don't think most Americans would condone that. So we have to ask ourselves, what particularly Mr. Brennan and others want that they don't already have and that we don't feel is excessive.
From After Snowden in your writing, in the history of the United States, it could be said about most, if not all places, when national security, domestic terrorism, and personal provocation clash with people's civil liberties, the former prevail. That is human nature.
That has been so historically, and we're very attuned to it, particularly this week in the wake of what happened in Paris recently. The citizens there and the watching world would be naive to think that at a time like that you don't want the police and the national security interests to take every measure to assure that the perpetrators of those acts of terrorism are caught, and that the powers that be are doing everything they can to see that it isn't repeated. But that doesn't mean anything goes, or we find ourselves not being in a democratic state. So there's always a question of balance, and it's very easy for national security interests to say, well, there's a ticking bomb, and if there's a ticking bomb, don't you want us to do everything? Of course, the answer to that is yes, but you can't live in a democratic society where everything is done in secret and where there are no controls, no checks and balances. I mean, the heart of a democratic government, our democratic government, is that we have a system of checks and balances. And what we've seen in the wake of 9/11 is that the Congress was not overseeing the national security establishment as well as we had hoped. And responsible people like Senator Graham, then the former governor of Florida, have been very critical of Congress failing in its role to the populace, to be checking what it is that the security establishment is doing. Similarly, the courts have been totally passive and deferential to the executive. Whenever the executive says state secrets are involved, the courts have totally, since 1953, backed off and don't examine the validity of those claims. Well, I'm not saying all of those claims are wrong, but some of them have been excessive. We have now determined in hindsight. And so we need, while the executive is doing everything in our name, we also need to be sure that Congress is checking that the rules that they've established have been followed. And that's not the view in post 9/11 by a lot of people in Congress now, and that the courts are doing what they should be doing. And so we have chapters in this book that deal with each of these questions. The goal of this book wasn't to decide or advocate whether or not Edward Snowden was a hero or not, but to explore the issues that his revelations made public. Has the press been active enough? Do we protect whistleblowers in appropriate cases? What's the role of leaks in national security cases? What are the role of the courts? What should the role of Congress be? What happens with regard to citizens' privacy in a digital age where so much is made public voluntarily, but with the understanding or assumptions that doesn't mean total, total X-rays, so to speak, of all of our lives. Those are complicated but very important issues, and we have 6 very, very world-class students of those subjects contributing, I think, valuable chapters to those questions.
Who are some of those contributors?
Well, we have Harding Carter writing about the press. Harding was supposed to be here, but health reasons kept him from getting to the fair. But Harding was a longtime editor of a newspaper in Mississippi, and also was Assistant Secretary of State in the Carter administration. So he's been at both sides of the table, both as a newsman pushing to project information to the public, even when he's being told by the executives that he shouldn't be doing that, and also an official of the government in the State Department, needing to withhold in certain instances information that can't be made public. So he brings a very balanced and probing perspective to the questions of the role of the press. The dean of the Berkeley Journalism School and a columnist for the Miami Herald, Ed Wasserman, writes a chapter on whistleblowers, which I think I think he's the best man on this subject, pointing out that in the case of Snowden, for example, he turned his information over to 3 people. Laura Poitras, who won an Emmy, not an Emmy, but a Oscar for her documentary on this subject, and to two print journalists, one for the Washington Post, one for the Guardian, who both won Pulitzer Prizes. But Snowden, who's the source of the information has been indicted for espionage. There's a kind of disconnect there. I mean, either this is valuable information that the public has determined was very worthwhile and prize winning at that, or it's criminal, but it can't be both, I would think. So, I mean, those are some of the writers. Tom Blanton, who runs the National Security Archive in Washington, knows more about classification of documents, FOIA, than just about anybody, and he's written a very interesting chapter on classification, which gets to one of the points of the balance we talked about earlier. In the wake of 9/11, Brennan and who was then in the White House and others said, we need to gather the biggest haystack of information because we don't know what we don't know, and so we don't want to miss anything. We need to have the biggest haystack. Well, critics of that have taken the position that we don't know what we do know because the haystack has been so expanded that the needles of information, to use that metaphor, have been lost.
And in fact, in your book, you quote the Wall Street Journal is saying 75% of all U.S. internet traffic is being vacuumed by the U.S. surveillance programs, including private communications of both U.S. and foreign citizens. And government agencies classify thousands of documents every day, millions of documents every year. So many documents are now classified that the term has no meaning anymore. That's just a little bit of taste of after Snowden, privacy, secrecy, and security in the information age. Ronald Goldfarb is the editor, and he also writes the intro and the close. And now, from the Miami Book Fair, we're going to take you back to Chapman Hall.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.